Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So hi everyone, welcome to DHPSNY's Housing Material Basics webinar. Thank you so much for attending. I'm Gillian Marcus, DHPSNY's Preservation Specialist. Some of you may have met me before at site visits or may have attended one of my classes, but for those of you I haven't met before, I'm very glad that you're here. So just a bit about DHPSNY before we get onto the topic at hand. DHPSNY is a 5-year initiative to deliver essential training and services to New York's collecting institutions. DHPSNY services include archival needs assessments, preservation and conservation surveys, guidance with strategic planning, and access to a variety of educational programs and workshops. Right now, we're just finishing off year 2 and about to start year 3. DHPSNY is making these services available free of charge to New York-based organizations that collect, preserve, and make accessible historical records and library research materials, which is all of you. So thank you. DHPSNY is a collaboration between 2 long-running New York programs, the New York State Archives Documentary Heritage Program and the New York State Library Conservation Preservation Program. It was established in 2016 by the New York State Education Department's Office of Cultural Education to ensure consistent and comprehensive services to the vast network of organizations that safeguard New York's records and make them accessible. All right, so on to today's topic, housing material basics. Is everybody doing okay with the audio? I'm just checking in. Sorry. All good there. Great. Okay, so this webinar will be focused on becoming an informed consumer when selecting products for archival, library, and museum collections. We will talk about preservation terminology and how to look beyond descriptions such as archival or conservation grade in order to understand what you're really buying. We will also discuss manufacturing standards to look out for and some suggestions for choosing materials that are safe for paper, books, photographic material, and collections with oversized material. Because preservation terminology can sometimes be very confusing, I've uploaded some materials which should hopefully be helpful for you to look at either during or after the webinar. So this includes a basic glossary of conservation and preservation terminology, a CCAHA guide to selecting storage materials, a guide to decision making for housing paper objects, and a National Park Service guide to buffered versus unbuffered materials. So some of the preservation terminology I'll be presenting here may be very basic for some of you, but it may be completely new information for some others. So we're just going to go over some of the basics pretty quickly. Even if you know this stuff, it's always a good idea to have a refresher. And I want to make sure that we're all on the same page going forward, because several of these terms can be misleading or confusing. So the terms we will be covering today are acid-free, archival, buffered and non-buffered or unbuffered, lignin-free, PAT, which stands for the Photographic Activity Test, polyester, polyethylene, polypropylene, and zeolites, which are molecular traps. If you have other questions about other terms that you've come across, please feel free to ask, because I'm sure that other people have them too. So we're going to start at the beginning with archival, and this may be the most confusing term of all, ironically. The Society of American Archivists defines archival as resistant to deterioration or loss of quality, allowing for a long life expectancy when kept in controlled conditions, not causing harm or reduced life expectancy. So this is very straightforward and clear. There's not much to be confused about with this definition. However, unfortunately, the term archival has been overused in commercial advertising for preservation materials to the point where it's nearly meaningless. So you often have to look beyond the terms archival or conservation grade, which, by the way, is another term that has been rendered meaningless over time. And you really want to try to understand what's in the material you're purchasing and how it's manufactured. It's a lot like any other commercial labeling. So, for example, an example I like to use is Hostess Twinkies having a label that says fresh baked taste. Doesn't really mean anything, but it kind of makes you think that it does. You know, it's something that it really can't prove one way or the other. So this can be very problematic when ordering housing materials because, well, you might think you're ordering the right things because of the words archival or conservation grade or preservation friendly. You might be doing more harm than good. Now that we're talking about the sometimes ambiguous use of the word archival, I also wanted to take a minute to talk about so-called archival mending tape. I get asked quite a bit if this is safe, and it can honestly be very confusing because these mending tapes and tissues are often sold by preservation supply houses, your Gaylords, your university products, Tawas, places like that. So the truth is that no tape is truly archival. And the packaging, even if it is removable, it is often only with the use of solvents under the guidance of a conservator. The adhesive in these tapes will eventually permeate the surface of the paper or the book that it's used on, staining it and possibly damaging the material. So unless something is expendable, which nothing in your collections really should be, I don't recommend the use of any kind of pressure-sensitive tape whatsoever. Even if it says archival, library, pH neutral, etc. Okay, moving on. Acid-free. So the term acid-free refers to material which was pH neutral at the time of production. On the pH scale, this is approximately a pH of 7. What this does not mean is that these materials will not become acidic over time. It means that the material was tested and determined to have a neutral pH of 7, more or less, at the time that it was made. Manufacturers of acid-free paper who pass the test requirements of ISO 9706 or ANSI Z39.48, and we'll talk about these just a little bit later. These standards are able to indicate this with a circled infinity symbol, which you can see on the screen there. That will be found on the package and sometimes even as a watermark on the paper itself. I'm sometimes asked what to do if you aren't sure whether the materials your archive is currently stored in are acid-free. So how can you tell if you have an old folder that's been around for a while and it looks okay? So in this case, you can use a pH testing pen to determine whether your current housing is or has become acidic over time. So use the pen to draw a line on the housing material that you're testing, not the archival materials, not the archival objects themselves, of course, not that anyone here would do that, but just gotta say it. Essentially, the color of the ink will change depending upon the pH of your material. Color change will differ with manufacturer, but the Abbey pH pen, which is a common one, will either draw ink in purple, which indicates a pH of 7 or above, so meaning that it's either neutral or basic or alkaline, or yellow, which is a pH below 6.5, which indicates that the material is acidic. These pens are really affordable. Most are under $10, and they're available on preservation websites as well as Amazon, eBay, things like that. And I just want to point out on the right side here, you can see an example of matte burn, where acidic, poor quality matte was used to mount this painting. And that kind of darkened color indicates where the acidic matte has actually sort of burned the object. So there's a lot of confusion regarding buffered or unbuffered housing materials and when to use each type of material. Buffered materials have had an alkaline reserve, usually 2% or 3% calcium carbonate. added during manufacture. This is the buffer, which gives the housing material an alkaline pH, and it helps to protect your archival objects from acid migration or acidic pollutants in the environment. However, this alkaline reserve can be depleted over time, and the housing material may become acidic in the future. So buffered materials will need to be replaced at some point. This just extends the lifetime that the housing materials are useful. Buffered materials are really great for using with the majority of archival and library items, with a few exceptions, which I will go over after the next slide. So non-buffered or unbuffered, so kind of referred to as either, is paper or tissue which has not been given an alkaline reserve, and so it has a neutral pH at the time of production. This doesn't mean that it is acidic, but it also doesn't mean that it's alkaline. It's just neutral. So why would you want to use this if buffered materials are so great? The answer is that there are some materials which can be very sensitive to the alkaline reserve in buffered materials. There's been a lot of debate surrounding this, but generally you want to avoid using buffered materials against objects which have protein-based materials. For example, silk or wool textiles, some ethnographic items, things made of bone or horn or hair, things like that. You definitely want to use unbuffered storage materials for cyanotypes and blueprints because the alkalinity of buffered materials can cause cyanotypes and blueprints to fade. Prussian blue pigment is very sensitive to alkalinity. So there is some debate around whether buffered enclosures can cause damage to color prints, but recent guidelines allow for the use of buffered enclosures for color prints. So you're pretty safe with that. This chart, which was put together by Lyricist, gives you a basic idea of when to use buffered or unbuffered paper and board. In general, most paper-based items in archives or libraries will be just fine in buffered materials. However, if you do have very old or unusual examples of printing processes in your collection, you may want to use unbuffered materials. It's worth knowing what you have in your collections for lots of reasons, but one reason being that it helps you to identify whether the housing materials that you're purchasing will protect or harm items in your collections. One very common term you'll see when shopping for paper housing is lignin-free, and this is an important designation. Before we talk about why you don't want lignin, though, we're just going to talk about what lignin is. So it's actually a polymer which is found in all vascular plants, and it makes vegetables firm, it regulates the transport of liquid in a living plant, and it allows trees to grow taller. In wood, lignin binds cellulose fibers together. So in nature, lignin is very important and necessary. Biologically speaking, it's there for a reason. The time at which it becomes problematic for us is when ground wood pulp papers are made. As lignin ages, after it's been ground up into a pulp and made into paper, it darkens and it breaks down into acidic byproducts. Papers which are made from ground wood pulp begin their life pretty acidic, and then things just kind of get worse from there. That's why you often find old newspaper clippings which are yellow and very brittle. Newspapers are made from ground wood pulp paper, and that has a very high lignin content. There are two main types of lignin-free Western papers that you'll encounter when you're ordering archival supplies. These are rag paper and chemical pulp papers. Many Eastern papers are an entirely different animal, so for the purpose of this webinar, we're focusing on housing materials excuse me, made with Western paper. Rag paper is, as the name says, paper made from cotton or other rags and not wood, so therefore it does not have a lignin content at all. On the slide, you can see a traditional paper maker using cotton rags. And on the left, you can see an 18th century print showing rags being cut into small pieces during manufacture. If you're looking at the label of a package of paper or ordering mat board online, you should see that it says rag paper or rag board, or more specifically 100% cotton. That indicates that it's rag paper or rag board. Just a bit about why paper has changed over time. Between around 1300 through 1800, roughly, give or take, Traditional methods were still used in many European paper mills, and paper quality was pretty good. This is when paper was made from rags. And that's why the paper support on many very old drawings and manuscripts on Western paper from this time are still in really good condition. They were made with rags rather than ground wood. Around 1800, when things begin to become industrialized and the paper making machine was put into use, impure wood pulp fibers were used as a much cheaper and easier to source material for paper instead of rags. So that marked a decline in paper quality. You do have another option for wood-based paper, which is lignin-free, and that's chemically treated wood pulp paper. Chemical pulp papers have been chemically treated, as the name says, to remove lignin from the wood source. Generally, chemically treated wood pulp paper will say lignin-free on the label, but it will not mention the words rag or cotton. Sometimes chemical pulp papers will be manufactured to still have a very low lignin content with buffering and can still be labeled as acid-free. So you want to make sure that you see the words lignin-free on labels. The photograph on the bottom right shows a man working with wood pulp in a paper factory. And just a quick note, sometimes you'll see on the package, it might say high alpha cellulose content. And alpha cellulose is generally been chemically treated wood pulp paper. If you're looking for housing and enclosures for photographic materials, you must look for an indication that it has passed the photographic activity test. Developed by the Image Permanence Institute up in Rochester, this test explores interactions between photographic images and the enclosures that they are stored in. The PAT is routinely used to test papers, adhesives, inks, glass, and framing components, sleeving materials, labels, photo albums, scrapbooking supplies and embellishments, as well as other materials. The standards ISO 18902-2013 and ISO 18916-2007 cover the specifications for this test, and we'll talk about that a bit more later. Products which have passed the PAT will have this labeled in the material specifications. It's really essential that materials used to house or store photographic objects have this designation. And again, we will mention that in just a bit. There are many types of clear plastic enclosures, and to be honest, they all look fairly similar to the naked eye. This is why it's so important to know the composition of any clear plastic sleeves that you'll be using to store archival materials. To ensure that you're using stable, good quality enclosures which will not harm your archives, look for either polyester, polyethylene, or polypropylene. The fourth P, which is polyvinyl chloride, or PVC, is not stable enough to use with archival collections. You really don't want to use any PVC on or near your collections. As it ages, PVC will leach plasticizer into your object, which can cause media to become more vulnerable and often offset onto the PVC. So if you ever kept a document in a plastic sleeve and then gone to remove it to find out that it's stuck to the plastic and the type or the ink has transferred, it's highly likely that this is a result of using PVC housing. Okay, and finally, zeolites, which are molecular traps, which in the most basic terms trap environmental pollutants or pollutants which may be released by the archival object itself, such as acetic acid, aldehydes, and sulfur dioxide. Microchamber and ArtCare are two brands which use this technology in interleaving paper as well as in mat board. Zeolites are sometimes combined with calcium carbonate to create paper products which are both alkaline and have molecular traps or molecular sieves. Zeolite is essentially a trade term for one type of molecular sieve, but there are others. Papers with molecular traps do have a finite lifespan when they become full, but this varies by manufacturer and the environment that they're used in. Each manufacturer should be able to provide general information about the lifespan of enclosure materials with zeolites or with other molecular traps. see here what the zeolites actually look like under the microscope at various magnification levels. So we touched briefly, it does look gross indeed. We touched briefly on standards in the last section, but I would like to look at what standards are in a little bit more depth. Standards are requirements, specifications, guidelines, or characteristics that can be identified consistently to ensure that materials, products, processes, and services are fit for their purpose. Standards allow researchers and manufacturers to set a bar that can be used by consumers as quality assurance. So in terms of standards for preservation and housing materials, pardon me, manufacturers aren't required to be compliant. So having a manufactured product tested to meet a standard is completely voluntary. However, if you do see an indication that a product has met the standard, for example, on the label or packaging, that tells you that it has been rigorously tested. The main standards issuing and regulating bodies for archival materials include ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, NISO, the National Information Standards Organization, and ISO, the International Standards Organization. ANSI, NISO Z39.48-1992 covers specifications for permanence of papers for publications and documents in libraries and archives. ANSI, NISO Z39.77-2001 covers guidelines for information about preservation products, and ISO 18902-2013 covers processed imaging materials, which means albums, framing, storage materials, scrapbook materials, basically anything which will come into contact with photographic materials. So we're going to move on now to selecting materials for paper and book collections, which will pull together some of the things that we've talked about previously. Paper enclosures are often a very good option, and they come in a variety of styles and configurations for different materials. Paper enclosures can range from envelopes to 4 flat folders to simple folio type enclosures where a piece of acid-free, lignin-free paper is folded in half. You can even make your own paper enclosures by using acid-free, lignin-free, buffered, or unbuffered depending on the materials that you're housing paper. Or you can order custom sizes. Remember that if you are housing photographic material, you always want to make sure that the material has passed the PAT. I tend to prefer housing materials which don't require you to pull on the object that you're storing inside. For example, a simple folder is good, so the easier that you can remove the item you're trying to store, the less likely it is to be inadvertently damaged. For small items, an envelope may be appropriate, but it's always best to use an envelope which is a little bit bigger than your item. So a tight fit can cause problems with access and retrieval. One other consideration is that you want to make sure that the paper envelopes don't have seams with adhesive that the objects can stick to. This is a little bit harder to check on when you're ordering materials online or through a catalog. But if you do get a chance to look at the materials firsthand, you want to check that there isn't any adhesive on the inside of the envelope. Interleaving papers are designed to provide protection and support between items, for example, in a folder with multiple prints. Interleaving paper is also used to provide extra protection for a mounted item while it's in storage, for example. There are many options for interleaving. There are different thicknesses of paper and tissue, and they come in buffered and unbuffered forms, as well as in sheets, which are pre-cut, and in rolls. You can cut your own. Microchamber interleaving papers are manufactured with molecular traps, as well as an alkaline reserve, and they help protect against and remove byproducts of deterioration and pollutants from the environment. They are more expensive than traditional buffered or unbuffered materials, but they are very excellent products, and they're great to use as interleaving papers. For photographic materials, I suggest using silver-safe paper or phototext paper, which are 100% cotton and unbuffered and are designed specifically to be used for housing photographic materials. As with any materials used with photographic collections, the interleaving paper you select should be PAT approved. So I don't know if this looks familiar to anyone, but glassine is not recommended, although it did used to be standard practice. And I get lots of questions about using glassine because it's fairly inexpensive, and a lot of archives and museums used to use it and seem to have a backlog of it that they're still using. But as you can see from this photo, and this glassine is, I'm not really sure, I think it's at least 20 years old probably. As glassine ages, it becomes very acidic and very brittle. If your archive or library already uses this material and you have a big backstock of supply, at the very least you want to change it frequently and regularly. But glassine isn't great for long-term storage and housing. It's also particularly problematic for storing photographic materials because it can stick to photographic emulsions or any slightly tacky media you might have. Plastic enclosures are also good for a variety of materials, particularly when you wish to keep an item protected, but you'd still like to be able to see the contents. For example, if a document has information on both sides. You want to look for polyester film. In preservation and archival supply catalogs, this plastic film is sometimes referred to as archival polyester, or under the trade names Mylar, excuse me, or if you're in Europe or Canada, Melanex. And it comes in different thicknesses and different sizes. Pre-made polyester enclosures are often sold pre-sealed on two sides, and I prefer to use the kind that are sealed on two adjacent sides, which is called an L sleeve. This makes it a lot easier to retrieve the item that you're storing if necessary without dragging it along the inside of that enclosure. You can also buy rolls or sheets of the material and you can fold them yourself or seal the edges using an ultrasonic welder. You will rarely want to completely encapsulate an item because that can inadvertently create a microclimate in there, which may accelerate degradation or may encourage mold growth. One concern you do want to think about with plastic enclosures is that they often have an electrostatic charge. And while this is great for helping to hold materials such as paper so that they don't slip out of the sleeve or folder, it can be very problematic for flaking, friable, or sensitive media. If you've ever had a staticky balloon, for example, you'll notice that all kinds of dust begins to adhere to it. And the same effect can occur with delicate media sticking to the inside of the plastic enclosure. In that regard, sometimes it is better to use a paper enclosure. If you've got anything that's flaking, if you've got, for example, a photocopy or a Xerox, it's better not to store those in plastic. And as with paper materials, any plastic enclosures must pass the PAT before they're able to be used with photographic materials. We do have a question, which is, what is the product called for polyester in Canada? It will either be called Mylar or Melanex. I believe they use Melanex in Canada, but it may also be sold under Mylar. It's a good question. And Melanex is, I believe, spelled M-E-L-I-N-E-X. So encapsulation between ultrasonically welded sheets of polyester is occasionally an option. I'm not a big fan because objects with friable media or unstable surfaces really should not be encapsulated. And you also want to be sure that whatever you're encapsulating does not off-gas any harmful compounds. They won't be able to escape the encapsulation, and the object will kind of just end up stewing in its own disgusting juices, for lack of a better way to describe that. So if you're creating an L sleeve or an enclosure, you can use ultrasonic welding, but generally it's best to avoid sealing in the polyester on all four sides. Making an enclosure by using double-sided tape around the edges is also not a great idea. It's tempting, and it's easy to do. However, the adhesive from the double-sided tape will migrate to the inside of the enclosure over time, which will cause the object to become sticky and make it very difficult to remove, which can expose the, the archival material or your museum object to potentially harmful byproducts of the adhesive as it deteriorates. And when you're using mats, they should be as acid-free, lignin-free, and buffered. Ideally, 100% cotton rag board is best if possible. If you're mounting something which is sensitive to the alkaline buffer that is found in buffered materials, you of course can choose unbuffered board. All materials used for mounting photographs, again, should have passed the PAT. You can purchase art care board, which is manufactured with molecular traps to provide protection against common oxidative and acid gaseous pollutants such as ozone, oxides of nitrogen, sulfur dioxide, as well as hydrogen sulfide, carbon disulfide, ammonia, formaldehyde, and peroxides. So a whole bunch of nasty stuff in the environment. And art care board can really help protect against that. The object itself should be attached to the back mat with Japanese paper hinges, never ever with tape. So you don't ever want to use tape. And you also don't want to ever dry mount anything to a mat because that puts heat and pressure on objects and it's very difficult to remove. And if anybody listening isn't sure what I'm referring to when I mention dry mounting, it's when you put a sheet of adhesive tissue between your item and a piece of mat board and put it in hot press. And this causes the adhesive to melt and secures the item to the board. So the entire backside of the object is just pretty much glued to your piece of mount board. It used to be a very common way to mount photographs. I know when I was in art school that was very common for us to do. But it's very difficult to try to remove prints which have been mounted this way. So no dry mounting unless the thing you're dry mounting is expendable. When you're storing matted materials, you always want to place a sheet of interleaving tissue or interleaving paper between the top and bottom mat. So on top of the matted item, underneath that top window mat, to cover the object and protect it from abrasion. Mounting objects, even when they're not designated for immediate exhibition, can also be a really good way of keeping them protected while they're in storage. Cylinder boxes or clamshell cases are usually used for housing art on paper, mounted art on paper, photographic prints, manuscripts, maps, and other treasures. They are especially good for housing matted paper materials. Cylinder boxes are basically a more elegant alternative to the standard archival crate box, but they're just as good. They can be securely closed and labeled, and the spine of the box becomes a drop side when the box is opened. So it's easier to retrieve materials. The hard case also provides a little bit extra protection from physical forces, and it's easy to label. So essentially, cylinder boxes are a fancier, more highly structured version of the clamshell box. You'll usually see them in museum or special collection storage. Book boxes provide protection for fragile books with loose pages or cover elements. So 4 flat boxes like the one in this picture here are commercially available, but they can also very easily be assembled in-house. Clamshell book boxes are another way of boxing up a fragile or a rare book, and they can be ordered pre-made or constructed yourself. Similar methods can be used to house photographic case objects, for example, tin types, amber types, and daguerreotypes, which also kind of have that book-like structure. If you have a damaged book, for example, maybe one or both of the book's boards is loose, and you're not able to spend the money on book boxes, for example, at the time that you're doing rehousing, one temporary measure you can do is to carefully wrap the book with acid-free, lignin-free paper, kind of like how you would wrap a present, and use unbleached cotton twill tape to tie it together. This will provide some stability until you can source a box, but really having a box of some kind is the best protection you can have for that rare, valuable, or fragile book that you're trying to preserve. Book shoes, I don't know if anyone's seen these, but they are great for providing support to both the spine and the text block of a book. They can be made yourself. This is an example of one that I made. And there are very good step-by-step instructional information sheets and videos available online. But essentially, the bottom of the shoe is individually measured to the depth of the text block, and it provides support for the text block to keep it from slumping. It also protects the boards and the spine. Book shoes are much less common than boxes because they're pretty fiddly to make, and the measurements need to be pretty exact in order for them to work. But they are an option to support a slumping text block, particularly for a very fragile book. Okay, so now on to housing photographic materials. I know we touched on this briefly, but it's worth mentioning again. So the PAT test, the photographic activity test, analyzes materials for potential chemical reactions between the materials used to make enclosures and photographs stored in these enclosures. The PAT is used to test the components of enclosures, and that includes things like adhesives, inks, paints, labels, and tapes. The test involves incubating materials in temperature and humidity controlled chambers to simulate aging, and it takes about 4 to 6 weeks to carry out. After incubation and sample evaluation, then usually a final report is provided to the manufacturer. So that's just a little bit about how that test works. All material which is intended to house photographic prints or negatives should be PAT approved, even if it's not touching the photographic materials directly. So this includes things like boxes and folders. Glass lantern slides and glass plate negatives in good condition should be stored vertically. Glass is heavy, and a stack of glass plate negatives is so heavy that the weight can actually cause the plates on the bottom to fracture. Also, storing glass plates vertically can help to minimize the damage of an impact from above. So should something fall on the box, the negatives will be a little bit more protected if they're stored vertically rather than flat horizontally. Glass plates can be stored in small envelopes or flat folders made of acid-free, lignin-free, PAT-approved paper, and then stored in appropriately sized boxes. Small pieces of stable, acid-free and lignin-free PAT-attested board can be used as support between glass plates if they are especially fragile. And there's, just one question. Do you recommend storing fragile books standing up, like on a library shelf, or laying down? I prefer them to lay down horizontally. That's a good question, so that it gets that support along the body of the text block. Really, a book shoe is for something that it doesn't have a lot of damage. So something severely damaged, it should be stored laying down horizontally. Broken glass plate negatives, and I don't know if you have too many of those, but they can be stored flat in customized sink mats. This slide shows a broken glass plate negative in 2 fragments on the left, and they're stored in 2 separate paper envelopes. And then the same negative you can see on the right, and this is stored in a customized sink mat, which is designed to hold both fragments in the same enclosure while preventing potential edge loss or abrasion on the right. So it is a little bit fiddly to make, but there are tiny little spacers separating the broken glass shard from the body of the glass plate negative. So they're still held together. You can still see the image, and they are protected until they can be conserved. If you do choose to go this route, sink mats are heavy as well, really heavy. So no more than 5 should be stacked together at that point. It's a complex housing solution, but it is a great idea if you have a very special glass plate negative, which you want to keep safe while it's waiting for conservation treatment. Excuse me. Film negatives should be stored in either polypropylene, PAT-approved sleeves, or inappropriately sized individual paper or polyester sleeves. Multi-negative sleeves can be stored in a PAT-approved box, folder, or archival binder. And individually housed negatives can be stored in appropriately sized PAT-approved archival boxes. You can find sizes for strip and sheet film from 35 millimeter to very large format. Photographic prints can be stored in polyester sleeves, so your Mylar, your Melanex sleeve, as well as print folders made from paper that have been PAT approved. And again, just a reminder, you don't want to put any prints, any photographic prints that have flaking and the emulsion in polyester because of that electrostatic charge. Some special considerations that you might want to keep in mind include panoramic photographs, which will need a specially sized folder. They do make those so you can purchase them, or you can make them yourself. And ideally, panoramic folders should then be kept in flat files. Cyanotypes, which the image on the right here, this feather, that's an example of a cyanotype, are best stored in unbuffered housing materials due to the sensitivity of Prussian blue to fading when they're exposed to alkaline materials. Photographic albums and scrapbooks are some of the most difficult items to preserve, mainly because they have so many different components. There could be an entire webinar devoted to housing photograph albums, but there's just a few points that I'd like to go over briefly. If you are storing a good quality photo album, or a photo album which is historically important, you can store it in an appropriately sized archival box, the same as any other material. If a photo album is really deteriorating and has acidic paper, or if it has those really awful magnetic pages, and by those I mean those kind of sticky pages where you can actually stick your photographs or your notes in there, those don't age very well, and they are unfortunately still really common. So if you've got one of those, it might be time to consider whether the photographs should be removed and stored separately from the album itself. That is, of course, an institutional and curatorial decision based on historical and archival value of the album, its condition, and other factors. But sometimes it gets to the point where you do have to remove photographs and store them separately. So we talked a little bit about boxes in the previous sections, but there are so many boxes sold by preservation houses that it can sometimes be really difficult to choose the right one for your needs, or to even identify if there's necessarily a difference between them. We'll just talk about these briefly, not too much to say about boxes. Storage boxes come in dozens of varieties. What's most important is that they are made from acid-free, lignin-free cardstock or board, and that they have passed the PAT if you're using them for photographic materials. You're going to hear me in your sleep tonight saying they must have passed the PAT if you're using them for photographic materials, but it's true for anything that you use in your photographs. Anyway, you can purchase boxes which are buffered or unbuffered, and you can also purchase the board separately in order to make custom boxes yourself. The options are pretty much endless. When it comes to choosing vertical versus horizontal storage, it really comes down to a matter of preference and a matter of use. So if you have collections which are stored in files and are used often, they're accessed quite a bit, a vertical storage box makes it easier to access these materials without having to remove anything else in the box. A horizontal box, in contrast, is better, for example, for art on paper, for matted items, things like that. It also can depend on what you have the space for, on your shelves. The thing to watch out for when using vertical boxes is that you don't want to overfill them, of course, but you also don't want to underfill them so that the materials inside don't have enough support. When this occurs, you want to use a spacer, usually made of acid-free, lignin-free board, so that materials in the box can remain vertical, can remain upright. If the box begins to fill up, a spacer can then be removed. Spacers are very easily made yourself or bought. And you can see an example on the left side of that spacer that's right behind the folders. If you've got materials of different sizes in the same box, which you can see, for example, on the right, you can sometimes end up with areas of pressure. So, for example, a larger folder might start to keel over a smaller object. Pieces of acid-free, lignin-free board can be inserted between these different sizes of materials for support so that both the large and small materials receive support. And you can see that on the right side over there. So this is an example of vertical storage gone wrong. You can see how these photographs have become curled and distorted as a result of being stored vertically with no support spacers or interleaving. So onto horizontal storage. Not too much to say about it, but a drop front box allows you to safely lift objects out with enough space to keep from accidentally gouging the edges by trying to slip your fingers in when lifting materials out. So you want to look for those drop front or drop side boxes. And this will also protect your fingers from paper cuts. Boxes which do not have a drop front can make handling more difficult and less safe for the objects. So in general, horizontal storage should always have one side which can be pulled down. Once you understand housing terminology, it's really easy to modify existing boxes to your heart's content. This is an example of someone creating trays out of mat board and string. It looks like a little bit of mylar too. This large box has multiple removable trays in it, so the objects are held in place with pieces of alkaline corrugated board. And in this case, you would want to make sure that the trays are properly supported and that they do not kind of smush the objects below. And these string handles are really great to pull up the trays easily and safely. So you can adapt all kinds of materials to suit a variety of collections. The final section that we will talk about today is housing oversized materials. This is probably one of the biggest issues that I see when I visit institutions. Unfortunately, oversized materials often get neglected because there isn't enough space, and institutions just aren't sure what to do with them, which is understandable. Well, I can't really solve the space problem. Today, I can talk about some suggestions for ways to store oversized materials in a way that will keep them safe. So ideally, oversized flat materials should be stored in either an appropriately sized box or in flat files. And flat files are really great for taking advantage of a small amount of space while having very large flat materials. If you do choose to store flat materials in flat file storage, you will want to choose lignin-free archival folders, and you'll want to leave enough space so that the drawer can be shut without catching the objects inside. Similarly, size items should also be stored together. What you don't want to do is store rolled objects in a flat file drawer, and I see this often. Although it seems like it would be protective, often rolled items get kind of crunched in the drawer when it's shut. They get caught in the back of the drawer, or they get caught in the front of the drawer as it's closing. And for the same reason, you also want to be careful not to overfill the drawers. You don't want to pile your collections in there sort of on top of one another willy-nilly without some kind of interleaving. Because that's a good way for things to get scratched or dented by one another. Oversized rolled objects are particularly tricky because of their size and their awkwardness. Large rolled objects are often the most neglected in archival collections, or at least the ones that I usually see. They tend to be left overhanging shelves or squished or stuffed upright into a box or a trash can, which is sad for them. So probably everyone here has at least one oversized rolled object hanging around their collection that's stored in a similar way. And I mean, it happens. Sometimes you have to do what you have to do. As I mentioned before, I sometimes see rolled objects in flat files, and that also leads to them getting crunched while the drawer's opened or shut. And you also don't want to store rolled oversized materials vertically long term because that puts pressure on one end. So what you can do is to roll your oversized large object around a large diameter acid-free, lignin-free paper tube. The tube should extend past the edges of the object, and there should be an interleaving of alkaline paper that's rolled up along with the object so that the front does not get abraded by its back. Of course, if you are storing a large blueprint, you would want to use unbuffered paper, for example, instead of alkaline paper. Once the object is rolled onto the tube, the whole thing can be covered with acid and lignin-free paper or thin paperboard and tied with cotton twirl tape. The tube can then be stored on a rack or in a box. The important thing is to give the rolled object support, which it gets from that paper tube. So you don't necessarily need to store this in a box. I mean, it's ideal and it's very protective, but you know, if all you can do is store it around that rolled support, then that's even one step better than putting it in a trash can or a box. You just store that rolled object straight on the shelf. So we're pretty much at the end of the webinar now, and I just want to take some time to answer any questions you might have. And it looks like someone says that they use film negative sleeves that have tab closures for housing silk memorial ribbons. That's a really great idea. So while the questions are coming, just to repeat what Jason mentioned, the webinar will be available online within a few days or a week or so, and it will have the PowerPoint you see here as well as the handouts that are attached. Let's see, questions. Is it ideal to put oversized maps in a map or file drawer, or is it what you just said, storing them in archival tubes, the way to do it? I would suggest, if they are flat, they're already flattened, putting them in a map or a plan chest or I've just forgotten the word for that. The map file drawer, because that's really the best protection. Some things have been rolled for so long that they're naturally rolled, and those things that you want to keep rolled around archival tubes. But if it's already flat, really storing them in a flat file is probably the best recommendation. Someone has asked, Sandy's asked, what is the best way to flatten maps for insertion into map drawers? It depends on how fragile they are, what their condition is. If they're very fragile and they're rolled, if they present quite a lot of resistance, that's something that you would want a conservator to do. They would humidify and flatten it. If it's something which is only slightly curled and is in good condition, you can do a little bit of flattening by putting you know, a little bit of a heavier cardstock over it and letting that kind of gently relax those sides. But I really recommend having a conservator flatten anything. Again, particularly if it is very stiff, if it is fragile, you know, if it's brittle, anything like that, you really don't want to flatten that yourself. Let's see. Gina asks, is there no ANSI NISO standard for photographic materials? There probably is. What we typically use. There are ANSI 18916, which is the photographic activity test. Excuse me. And there's other ones which cover things like particular types of materials like nitrate, cellulose nitrate. There's also 18902, which covers imaging materials, processed imaging materials, so albums, framing, and storage materials. So there are quite a few standards for photographic materials issued by ANSI. Someone has asked, do I use a double-sided tape that is available from Gaylord? It's supposed to be okay for archival use. Absolutely, the double-sided tape is not good for use with anything archival. It really isn't archivally safe, even though it says archival on there. It will often sink into your materials, it will stain them, the adhesives can age, it can change the paper, so I don't recommend using any tape at all. Double-sided tape, regular tape, even if it says archival on it, it's really a good idea to not use those. That's a good question. But yeah, I never recommend any tape be used on or near an object. Let's see, here's a question for Amy. Do real archivists use gloves for handling paper and photographic materials? I've heard this is a myth. That's a good question, Amy. Generally for photographic materials, you would use nitrile gloves. For paper, you can use nitrile gloves or your hands. And when I say your bare hands, I mean after, of course, you've washed them really well and dried them. But it used to be that people would use cotton gloves, and those really aren't a great idea. So for paper, for books, things that are fairly stable, you want to use your hands, of course, after they've been washed and dried. But for photographic materials, for anything that has metal in it, a metallic element, some textiles, you do want to use nitrile gloves to handle those. And that is a good question. Are there any other questions? Recommended lifespan for housing. That is a good question. You know, it really depends because it depends on the environment that's in your archive. It depends on the materials that are housed in them, so how acidic they might be. Unfortunately, there isn't really a good, there isn't really a standard lifetime for housing that I can give you, which is why they make those pH pens, so you can sort of check them out yourself. Check how acidic they are. But that is a really good question. I can't give specific advice on specific objects. Ellen's mentioned a mercantile journal, but Ellen, if you want to email me directly, you can do so, and I'll be happy to help you out. My email address, again, for anyone else who might want to email me, it's gmarcus, so gmarcus, @dipsny.org. Any other questions? While I'm waiting for any last minute questions, I just want to say thank you for attending this webinar. And I want to encourage you to contact us if you're interested in applying for preservation, archival needs, or condition survey, or if you're interested in our strategic planning or documentation programs. I also encourage you to check our social media for information, updates, and the occasional gem, which is unearthed from a New York State archive or library. I really can't talk anymore. Let's see, one question. My email address is gmarcus @DHPSNY.org. And someone asked about storing a jacket. That would probably be, you would probably want to use a padded tissue, which would be unbuffered. And there's some information, if you email me directly, I'll be happy to send you information on storing a jacket, either on a hanger or storing it in a box. So if anybody else has questions, thanks, Jason. That is my email address there. You can email me directly if you have questions about very specific materials or anything else, really. So thank you so much for attending. I hope everybody has a great day.